Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Nedarim, Daf Yud Beis, and we're starting 6 or 7 lines from the bottom of Yud Aleph Amud Beis. We've been in the midst of a discussion where people are accepting upon themselves Nedarim by comparing them to other things. So our Mishnah, as it's referenced here in the 2 dots on the bottom of Yud Aleph Amud Beis, says, what if we say that this meat is tahor or vitame or nosar or pigul? We said in all of those cases, usr. What usr means is that food is usr is because the food is usr because you did what's called hatfasa, that you created a proper association. Just like this food that is over there is usr, I want this food to be like that food. So therefore that functions as a neder in a kinui kind of way. And the Gemara is going to be digging in a little bit into our Mishnah based on a question from elsewhere. And says the Gemara at the 2 dots on Yud Aleph Amud Beis, Ba'i Rami Bar Chama. This one question will be worked on the entire day today. We'll be stopping at the 2 dots on the top of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, about a third of the way down actually in Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, which will hopefully make tomorrow a little bit shorter. What's tomorrow? Is today Sunday? Well, okay, it doesn't help. Okay, I was going to say I'm out of town Wednesday. Even though you're laughing at me already, this is not even nice. So Wednesday I'm not here. I should be back by Thursday night, but Wednesday I'm not here. So I was going to say we can jump ahead, but it's too far ahead. Okay. If a person says, I have a piece of meat sitting in front of me, and I want to compare the status of that meat to the basar of a zivchei shlamim, to a korban shlamim, la'achar zrikas damim. Now, we should be somewhat familiar that zrikas hadam is the moment when kapara takes place, and also is the matir for that animal to be eaten if it's a shlamim. We know that an olah cannot be eaten, but a shlamim can be eaten. So what's the comparison? This meat is like that meat, what kind of neder is that? That meat is mutter after zrikas damim, right? So says the Gemara, if what you said was that exact language, you're making an association between the piece of meat that has no status in front of you to a piece of meat that has a mutter status to eat, because you're comparing to zivchei shlamim after zrikas hadam. That food is mutter to eat for the bailim. Let them eat away. This piece you're trying to make an neder. I hereby forbid this piece of meat like that meat that's mutter to eat. It's incongruent. So of course it should be mutter. So therefore the Gemara says you're right. Really, Rami Bar Chama's question was much more narrow, and the language wasn't as he presented. 4 lines from the bottom, El Kigon, to Machis Basar Zivchei Shlamim, Umachis Tehetera Gabe. He has 2 pieces of meat in front of him. One is the meat of Zivchei Shlamim, and one is the meat that has no status yet. V'amar zeh kazeh. This meat that I have over here that I want to eat today, or maybe that I don't want to eat, it is hereby like the zivchei shlamim, but he only says zeh kazeh. But we don't know, says the Gemara, what the intent of the comparison was. Mai, says the Gemara. Do we say be'ikaro kamatvis? Do we say that when he said zeh kazeh, that this piece of meat that I just bought at Jewel, I want to give it the halachic status of meat that is zivchei shlamim? Do we want to say it's like the meat prior to zrikas hadam, and therefore it's mamash and neder and it's usher to eat? Oh, or perhaps behetera kamatvis, really, he was referencing a zivchei shlamim after zrikas hadam. What is the stam assumption of a person who looks at a zivchei shlamim and he says, zeh kazeh, this meat that I just bought from Jewel, this corned beef is exactly like the zivchei shlamim? Do we say me'ikara? Do we say be'ikaro kamatvis? He's going back to the original status of the meat prior to zrikas hadam, or do we assume the lenient side, there already was zrikas hadam? That's a great question, and it's the Gemara seems to not care. I'll tell you why the Gemara doesn't care. Because when the language was so explicit, like Rami Bar Chama, there were no 2 options. Rami Bar Chama said, this meat is achar zrikas hadam. So clearly the Gemara says, I want it to be like zivchei shlamim. The Gemara's like, you mean the current status of the zivchei shlamim, or before? Like, we don't know exactly. Like, it could lean in your direction. Like you're saying, if right now it's zrikas hadam, maybe the neder doesn't count. This is Rami Bar Chama's question. He's asking your question. What does it mean? Zeh kazeh. When you say kazeh like that, do you mean like its originating form, which is usr, because it's no zrikas hadam yet, or no? So we don't know the mitzias, but even if it is post zrikas hadam, it doesn't matter. That'll be a chiddush, but that's Rabbi Bar Chama's question. Say the opposite. If that meat is definitely not yet zrikas hadam, then there's no shaila. For sure, it's a neder. I'm speaking out based on what you said. It has to be that way. The only shaila is after Zrikas Adam. Otherwise, it's pashut that it's a neder. Because if you say zeh kazeh, and not only is it shlamim, but it's also usher because there's no Zrikas Adam yet, then for sure it has to be exactly that case. Good, thank you for the clarification. So Amar Rava tries to give a response. Tashma. Let's look at the Mishnah that we learned on Shabbos. What did the Mishnah say? We said that if a person compares his food to nosar upigul, that it's going to be usher. Says the Gemara, v'ha nosar upigul la'achar zrikas damim hu. When do you have the isra of nosar and pigul? Oh, way after zrikas adam. We're talking about the expiration date of that meat, not from a medical perspective, but from a halachic perspective, way after. You have to eat it. Of pashut, it's after zrikas adam. So says the Gemara, if that's true, and nosar and pigul are usher, so then we have a bit of a clarity in our Mishnah. This is the Gemara. The Rishonim here point out, if you look in Rashi here, the Mefarish, that we're specifically talking about nosar. Yeah, you're correct, but it's actually quoting from the Mishnah, nosar upigul. It really should be saying nosar, but like we will see today, there are a variety of textual issues with our Gemara. I don't know that this would have changed in Bavli because I don't know that this would have changed in Bavli. This could just be the phrase of nosar. I don't know, but you're right. It could have been another way. So here the Gemara says that by nosar and pigul, it was achar zrikas adam. And what do we see the status is by nosar and pigul in our Mishnah? That a neder was created when I make an association between my food and nosar. V'haraya, that we are going be'ikaro matvis. We're going after the initial status of the shlamim prior to its having had zrikas adam. So then maybe we have an answer. Says the Gemara, we do not. Amar le Rav Huna bereid Rav Nasan, not correct. Benosar shel ola. Well, we're really morphing Rami Bar Chama's question here. Rami Bar Chama started with a very specific language. We said incorrect. It was only zeh kazeh. And then we said, not only were you incorrect, but you were really incorrect because we're not even talking about a shlamim. We're talking about an ola. Says the Gemara, if we're talking about an ola, and therefore zrikas hadam doesn't help, because what is so unique about an ola is that it's fully consumed. No one can eat it anyways. If that's true, says the Gemara, so then Amar le'im kain lisnei bibasar ola. Who cares about the nosar of an ola? That's like a double. There is no nosar by an ola. What does that even mean? You can't eat it anyways. The whole conversation is dead in the water. So what's with the language of nosar? Really, what's happening is that the nosar that's mentioned in our Mishnah, says the Gemara, must be talking about an ola. So the Gemara, that makes no sense. Should have said basar ola. Says the Gemara, you're right, but lomi boya kamar. It's coming to teach us the lomi boya. We know the structure of a lomi boya. Not only this, but even that. That's the structure of lomi boya. And says the Gemara on Yud Beis Medala 4 or 5 lines down. What is the lomi boya? Lomi boya basar ola to aser. Of course, it's going to be the case. If I compare a piece of meat that I bought at Jewel to basar ola to aser, to have a korban kamatfis, because I'm comparing my corned beef to a korban mamish, to an ola, that's for sure. Nosar upigul de ola, it's richa. However, when it comes to nosar and pigul of an ola, there it's richa. There we did need to specify what was going on, and that's why we added the word nosar. Why? Sal kadai techamina. I might have said that ki iser nosar, ki iser pigul, that nosar is a food that is mamish usher to eat. There's no matir for nosar. You cannot eat nosar. And the same is true ki iser pigul. V'havale kimatvis bedavar ha'aser v'lo mitzar. Kamash malan. All right, this requires a little bit of explanation. If I take a corned beef and I say I want this to be like nosar, that really should not work. It really should not work. Why? Because nosar is usher. It's not that it's usher to me right now. Nosar is usher forever. A shlamim is usher, but you can still make a neder on it because it will become mutter by the zrikas hadam. So the Gemara was a little bit torn. Do we treat this comparison like we would to nosar, which is categorically usher, and therefore maybe the havamina would be that there's no hatfasa. You can't even make an association between this corned beef and that nosar. It's not like the shlamim anymore. Shlamim will become mutter. Nosar will just be burned, gone. So says the Gemara, kamash malan, that even though it's usher right now, but because it used to be mutter, so therefore it's not like a chefza shel iser. If you wanted to say, I'm going to take on the status of corned beef like that chazer over there, that's not a neder. That food is iser. That food is iser. There's no hatfasa. There's no halachic association between my corned beef and that chazer. So is nosar similar to the chazer, in which case it's categorically usher. No nedarim can be made. It's apples to oranges. Or do we say, no, it's like the shlamim, because it used to be mutter. And the Gemara says, Kamash Malan, that we needed to specifically include the case of Nosar to teach us that one can be matfis, one is able to make an association between one thing and the other. Asks the Gemara, why is it that you seem to say that we don't have clarity to our question? Rabbi Bar Chama asked, and then we modified his question. Hey, which one is better? Do we say meikaro kamatvis or behetera kamatvis? Do we say that when one makes a comparison to a shlamim, that he's more similar to the primary status of the shlamim, pre-zrikas adam, which is aser, or post-zrikas adam, it's mutter? Which one is it? We tried to give an answer and we couldn't find one. The Gemara says, Meisvei, hang on 1 second. What is the question over here? Ezehu isar ha'amur b'Torah. What is the language to create a status of isar in the Torah? Namely, what is the right way to accept upon oneself a neder? Says the Gemara, Omar, if a person says, Hareini shelo ochel basar v'shelo eshte yayin ki yom shemes bo aviv, a person says, I'm not going to eat meat, and I'm not going to drink wine on the day that the father died, that, or kiyom shemes bo Rabba, on the day that the Rebbe died, or kiyom shenerag bo Gedalia ben Achika, or Gimel Tishrei, the day that we celebrate Tzom Gedalia, or kiyom sherisiv Yerushalayim b'churbana. That's what the Gemara says is the ideal language. Says Shmuel about this Gemara, about this brisa. Is this a Tosefta? No. Says the Gemara, Ve'amar Shmuel, how does Shmuel qualify this brisa? Vehu shenadur be'oso hayom. It has to be that on that day, we'll have to see what that day means, that on that day, that's when he accepted upon himself this neder. So it says the Gemara, Hechidami. What is the case when it seems to be that he's accepting this upon himself? Lav Kegon, isn't it a case to Koi Bechad B'Shva? He's sitting there just one random week, Demis Be'avuha, in the weeks that followed his father's death. Ve'afal Gav De'ikatuva Chad B'Shva, even though there were many Sundays, De'hatera, V'Katani Aser, even though, let's say the father died on Aleph Tishrei. Now it's 6 months later. He made no Nedarim between Aleph Tishrei and Aleph Nisan. Aleph Nisan, he decides that I'm going to make a Shavua, that I don't want to eat on this day, just like the day that the father died. So says the Gemara, it seems from the line of our Gemara, the brisa in the middle of the page, it seems the Katani Aser. What does that show you? Shma mina be'ikar hu dematvis. Even though it's Aleph Nisan and the father died 6 months ago, that when he makes a neder today, we go back 6 months to the earliest status, v'haraya, that we hold be'ikar kamatvis. So says the Gemara, why are you saying it's unclear? We have a raya brura. Says the Gemara, you misunderstood Shmuel. Shmuel wasn't talking about when there was a gap in time between the day of the father and every other Sunday. Every Sunday he restricted himself from meat, and therefore, to Shmuel hachi itmar. Here's the right way to understand Shmuel, 4 lines from the bottom. Amar Shmuel, v'hu shenadar ubame oso hayom va'elech. No, he makes the neder from the day that the father dies, and every Sunday that follows the day of that death, he restricts himself from meat. That's when, if he says that this coming Sunday I won't eat meat, that's when we say that it's going to be usur. If there were days in between, those Sundays in between, where he did eat meat, even though there were 1 week or many units of 7 days after the father's death, the whole thing falls to the wayside. So Shmuel is saying, you cannot learn out that meikaro kamatvis here. Why can't you learn out that we look back to that earliest moment? Because Shmuel wasn't talking about when there was a break in Isra. There was always an Isra on Sundays for him to eat the meat, and therefore no raya one way or the other. And the Gemara is going to try a third time still. We're 2 lines from the bottom on Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Amar Ravina, let's try again. Toshma. Kechalas Aharon, like the bread of Aharon. V'chi trumaso, and like the truma of... Right. It's not the pashtus of the reading of the Gemara. Yeah. Yeah, it's good to bring up. I didn't even look into that, but I didn't even assume otherwise. Let me just look to make sure that I'm.
Is it not a case of the Bauer is standing on the Sunday that was the anniversary of their...
Take a look at the Ran. Dibur Maskal de Shmuel Hachi Itmar Amar Shmuel Busha Nader Rabame Osa Meilech Klomar Kol Yemei Echad B'Shabbos She'avru Alav Shehein Ki Yom Shemes Bo Aviv Nesru Alav Beneder. Every Sunday from the time of the death until now. Maybe the Mefarish says otherwise. Well, he says the same thing. I mean, I hear you.
No, hold on. So, for example, if his father died on the first Sunday in the month of Nisan,
Mhm.
several years later, on the first Sunday in Nisan, so let it be like the first Sunday in Nisan. So it's several years, it wasn't when.
Hechatesi.
No, I was saying, the year that's already passed now he's trying to draw to it, as to your point, it's already been 3 or 4 years. So, the person doesn't have to fast on the day the father died, but on the York side, there is.
No, on the day when a person's an onain, on the day that their father dies, they're aser b'shtia and they're aser b'achilas basar. During Shiva, you can eat basar. Abe Polachek made a remarkable skirt steak during Shiva for our family. And we were having the best time. Someone knocked on the door. We're like, okay, everybody, somber faces back to the Shiva chairs. You know? I don't know where that I must be missing something here. I probably need to read the Ron more carefully. I'm sure it's correct, and I'm not. But let me just look at the previous one. Yeah, that's what the Ron says in the previous Dibur Maskil. The Ran Dibur Maskil dekoi bechad b'Shabbos 2/3 of the way down. He says near be'enai. The Ran says he believes to hachi perusha. She'omer b'yom echad b'Shabbos shehu b'yom shemes bo aviv. It's the yortzeit the minyan chodashim. So it's exactly 12 months. You go in echad b'Shabbos rishon shel Nisan. This is what you were saying that he said the first of Nisan. Yehei yom ze alai ki yom echad b'Shabbos rishon shel Nisan of the previous year. So correct. A year had passed. Okay, I mean it's close. I was a little. I was incorrect, so I'm glad you caught it. So let's try the third answer because we couldn't yet bring a raya as to whether or not we say me'ikaro kamatvis or not. Gemara says Amar Ravina Toshma kichalas Aaron, like the bread for Aaron, ukitrumaso mutter. If I say that this piece of meat has the status of chalas Aaron or the truma for Aaron, mutter. Why? No shaychas. That food's completely usher to me. It'll never be mutter to me. Good. What's the diuk? The diuk from this very short brisa is hakitrumas lachme toda usher. But if a person does a hatfasa, they make an association between the corned beef that they have in front of them to the trumas lachme toda, that would be binding. Turning to the top of Yud Beis Mid Beis, says the Gemara, v'hatrumas lachme toda la'achar zrikas damim hi. There's a korban toda that's brought. The matir for the lechem is rikas adam. So how could you make a hatfasa that says this corned beef is like that lachme toda if the lachme toda are only lachme toda after rikas adam? Steer me nube. That's a beautiful question of the Gemara. Says the Gemara, you're absolutely right. And maybe the diuk that we said at the very bottom line of Yud Beis Amud Aleph, that when the Brisa left room for interpretation, it was Kitrumas Lachme Toda Aser. Says the Gemara, incorrect diuk. Says the Gemara, second line, Ema, it's Kitrumas Halishka Aser. The money that we learned about this in Maseches Shkalim, that the money that went to the Lishka, that was used by the Tzibur. So there is in theory access to that. But it's usher, it's out of reach right now. So if this corned beef is like that lishka, good. That's a good neder. That makes perfect sense. Says Gemara, fine. You've corrected the diuk that I made in the brisa, but I'm left with a question still. Aval trumas lachme toda mai. Okay, but let's talk about the trumas lachme toda. Would you say that it's mutter because they're completely out of touch? Because there's something that is usher to make a hatfasa with? After all, if that's true, listening lachme toda b'kol shekain trumaso. We should have then said in the brisa on the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Aleph, it should have said lachme toda, and all the more so kitrumaso, because lachme toda may have some matir, and trumaso never has a matir. So if that's the case, that's what we should have said. And responds the Gemara, hakamash malan. Some girsos take out hakamash malan. Hakamash malan. Did I skip a line? No. Hakamash malan, trumas lachme toda trumasohi. That the status of lachme toda is the same status as truma. And therefore, hard pass. There's no way to make a hatfasa between a corned beef and the money for and the showbreads. That just doesn't work. That doesn't work. It has to be something that you have access to. In the language of the Rishonim, when you're making a hatfasa between my object and something else, it has to be something that's eligible to be nadur upon. I hereby bring upon myself the showbreads. You can't do that. I hereby bring upon myself a shlamim. Good to go. That's good material. I hereby bring upon myself a pig. No, it's usher. So only things that are nadur are things that are eligible for hatfasa. But things that are categorically usher, you cannot make an association between those two things. I'm good, Dad. I got it. Thank you. It's like a nightly conversation. My father is my drug dealer, by the way. For those of you out in Zoom land. He is a nuclear chemist after all. What he can stir up in the kitchen is there's still another approach possibly to the lachmei toda. Trumas lachmei toda nami kodem zrikas damimhu. When we reference the lachmei toda, we're not referencing a point in time after the korban toda is brought where there's an opportunity for the consumption of the lechem. That's not correct. What is the case here? Kigon de afrishinhu belisha. When the dough is separated as we do afrasha schala, when it's still in the dough phase. I'm very makbid on hafrasha because I like eating dough. So I'm constantly like, Richie, did you take off enough? And just pluck a little. It's really just my own achila, but I like the dough. But halacha l'maisa, we always take it that way. There are shilas and poskim. What if you forget to do hafrasha? Do you take a whole challah? It has to be b'kri, it has to be in one basket. How do you? Okay, these are shilas and poskim. Here the Gemara says there is a case scenario where the lachmei toda, where the hafrasha takes place. Maybe we should say that a hatfasa by lachmei toda is taka aser because it could be done at a time when it's aser, which is before Zrikas Adam. This is a real case scenario that we saw in the Amorai. What was the case? Lachmei toda shafa'an be'ar b'chalos yatza. The lachmei toda, there were 4 types of bread. We'll see their names lower in the Gemara. But there were 40 of them, and there were 10 of each. And if you took each of the 4 types, there's chametz, whatever. Let's say you take the chametz ones, and instead of making 10 of those, you make one massive challah, like the ones we see at weddings, these like 8-pound challahs that are just huge, unmanageable. So if maybe we can do that, the Gemara says, Yatza, hold on one second, Vaksiv, Arbaim. The Torah says we need Arbaim. How can you take your 10 and make it 1? We need 10 times 4, not 1 times 4. How did you make all 10 into 1? Says the Gemara, that's only the mitzvah. That's the ideal way to execute it. But in theory, if I took all 10 of one type of the lachmei toda and I made them into one oversized challah, good to go. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Mishkal truma. Wait, how would that even work in the first place? You need to be mafresh. You need to separate. How can that be? The pasuk says echad. What is the pasuk here? The pasuk reads, "V'ikriv mimenu echad mikol." Thank you. You have to take away truma. If you want to say that you took one challah from all of them, echad mikol korban shelo yitol mikorban al chavero. You can't do that. It needs to be one whole challah of its own. You can't take one piece of all pieces by being mafresh from the dough. V'chitema deshakil prusa mikol chad v'chad. If you're going to say you're going to take even one piece from each one, echad shelo yitol prusa, that also doesn't work. You have to do the hafrasha properly. Ella, it must be, says the Gemara, that we're not talking about hafrasha once it's baked. It must be dafrashinu belisha deshakil chada min chametz, v'chada min chalos, v'chada min rekikin, v'chada min revucha. So here too, we have no clarity, no perfect clarity in this approach to the lachmei toda, and that is approach number 2. But lema, perhaps, that the machlokes, or I should say the chakira that we started with, perhaps lema kitanoi, maybe it's actually a machlokes in the tanoi. Let me just review the chakira one more time, and then we'll dig into the last piece of Gemara for today. A person said, Zeh kazeh, my corned beef is like that shlamim, and we don't know where we were in the continuum of the shlamim. Was it pre-zrikas adam, in which case it's usher, in which case the neder is chal, or is it post-zrikas adam when the shlamim is mutter, and therefore you didn't do anything. So that's our chakir. Lema ketanoi. Where do we see this as a sample? 4 lines from the bottom on Yud Beis Mid Beis. Harei alai ki bechor. If I make a comparison, I want this piece of corned beef to be like an animal that's a bechor. Rabbi Yaakov says, then the corned beef in front of you is usher to eat. Your association was good. You made a real neder. Rabbi Yehuda Materi says, no, it's not a good hatfasa, and the association doesn't work. You're allowed to eat that meat still. You did nothing. These halachos are so subtle. They're so nuanced. Like if we ever passingly say, I would like this corned beef to be like X, you got to be really careful because it might be an issur d'oraisa to eat it. We could easily create scenarios. These halachos we never learn about them. We never talk about them, but they're very, very, very nuanced. So, hey Chidami, what's the case of this machlokes? How could either shita make sense? If we're talking about a time where the bechor is before Zrikas Adam and really the neder should be chal, then if so, my time of demand shari. If it's before Zrikas Adam and I make my atfasa to a bechor before Zrikas Adam, who could ever say that that's not a neder? And be'ila achar Zrikas Adam. And if in fact this bechor was already shechted and there was Kabbalah Holach and Zrikas Adam, then what did you do? Then it shouldn't count at all. And it should be totally mutter to eat then my time a demand to asar. Then why would someone say that you're another Rosh You cannot eat that food. So maybe suggest the Gemara, this is our chakira. One is matfis meikara, and one is not matfis meikara. Says the Gemara, elalav, what must then be the case so that there isn't this machlokas tanaim? It must be the machis besar bechor, umachis besar dehaich gabe. I have a piece of bechor in front of me, and I have a piece of corned beef in front of me. And I say, v'amar zekazeh v'tanaihi. Perhaps there is in fact a machlokas tanaim if I say zekazeh, just like we saw earlier. It says the Gemara, lo, that's not correct. Really, this brisa has nothing to do. This brisa about the bechor is not even comparable to our case because the kule alma lifnei zrikas adam, as it relates to the bechor, everyone agrees that we're talking about pre zrikas adam, and the bechor is aser. And if the bechor is going to be aser because it's pre zrikas adam, then why would there ever be a shita that the neder wasn't chal? My time of demand shari, Omar Kra, because he has a pasuk. The reason why he says this neder doesn't work is ki yidor, ach yidor bedavar hanadur. You can only make a neder on something that's nederable. You can't say, I hereby make this animal a bechor. That's not how it works. The korban has an automatic status of being a bechor. If that's true, then when you make a neder about a bechor, it's a zero. It's not neder worthy. It's not eligible for a neder. And therefore, my time of demand shari, you might have thought the animal is a bechor. It's pre zrikas adam. My time of the shari. What do you mean my time of the shari? You're not allowed to make a neder with a bechor because the pasuk says ki yidor. Achi yidor b'davar hanader. La fuke bechor the davar aserhu. The davar ha'aserhu, because the bechor itself is always going to be aser in its status. It's born that way. It gets shechted that way. And there's no time in between. Wow. Well, if that pasuk is true, that we have a drasha gemura that teaches us that you're not allowed to make a neder with a bechor, well then, uman de asar, what does he do? So says the Gemara, Amar Kra Hashem. We have an extra part of the pasuk, l'rabos davar ha'asar, to teach us that you are even able to be matfis with something that's asar, even a bechor. So really, the machlokes we're dealing with is not a question of meikara kamatvis, meikara lo kamatvis. That's not our chakira. This is a question of learning the psukim. And according to the man deshari in regards to the bechor, the one who says that if you compare your corned beef to a bechor, it doesn't work, he says, sorry, the whole thing is a zero. You cannot make a neder on an ineligible item. And a bechor is ineligible because it's an automatic status animal. It's always aser. The other shita lashem includes something that's aser. Uman deshari. Okay, let's just keep going back and forth, a little ping pong. If we're going to say that the word lashem is the rabos of davar ha'asur, so then the shita who initially said that we already have our answer, that la'afuke bechor the davar asur. What does he do with the word lashem? Uman deshari lashem my abilei, says the Gemara, no problem. Mibayle lematfis bechatas v'asham. He says the word lashem teaches us that we are allowed to be matfis a piece of corned beef to a chatas and an asham. Asks the Gemara, why that and not a bechor? Umar Ra'is, why is it that you saw L'Rabos Chatas V'Asham that we are allowed to do a hatfasa to make an association between a corned beef and a Chatas and an Asham? Ulahotzi Esabechor. Why did you make a distinction? Says the Gemara, Mar Be'ani Chatas V'Asham Shu Matvis Beneder, because those are things that I can bring about through a neder. Umotzi Esabechor Shu Kadosh Mimeimo. But a bechor is not matfis beneder. A bechor becomes a bechor b'meimo, just it's firstborn, just what it is. Says the Gemara, uman de asar. What about the guy who still says that it's going to be asar? Bechor nami matfiso benederhu. It can even be nitfas beneder. How so? The Tanya. Mishum Rebbe Amru, minayin lenolad bechor besoch beso shem mitzvah lehakdisho, the active verb of being makdishit, a beautiful raya. Maybe there is an activity, an action, a maisa that you do that makes the bechor finally be a bechor. Says the Gemara, Shne'emar hazachar takdish, a beautiful pasuk. Says the Gemara, man deshari le. What is he? Man deshari. What does he say? Kilo makdish le, milo mikdash. Even if you don't do anything, you think the bechor is not going to become a bechor. Okay, you should be makdish, but the maisa it's a bechor without you. What if the Bailim died? The animal's not a Bechor. The animal's for sure Bechor. So what do you mean? Yeah, the pasuk says the Zachar Taktish, but it doesn't mean that it isn't one without it. So this is why the Gemara says that there is no comparison between our Chakira of Me'ikara Kamatvis and not Me'ikara Kamatvis, and the case of Bechor. That case is simply an argument in the Psukim. Emir Hashem, tomorrow we'll pick up 2/3 of the way down on Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Wishing you all a beautiful night.